The trip that Pope Francis made to Canada, that was in 2022. He visited Quebec City, Iqaluit, and Edmonton on what he termed a penitential pilgrimage. Francis apologized for the abuse and assimilation the church forced on Indigenous people through residential schools. He delivered his remarks in front of survivors, their families, and Indigenous dignitaries on powwow grounds south of Edmonton.
In the face of this deplorable evil, the Church kneels before God and implores His forgiveness for the sins of her children. I myself wish to reaffirm this with shame and unambiguously. I humbly beg forgiveness for the evil committed by so many Christians against the Indigenous peoples.
For more on the impact the Pope's apology had on residential school survivors and their loved ones, the CBC's Alexander Silberman joins us from Regina. And Alexander, what are some of the lasting effects of that apology?
Well, Ian, the mixed reaction to the apology reflects in many ways this complicated relationship between Indigenous peoples in Canada and the Catholic Church. This apology was something, of course, that residential school survivors fought for years before it happened. Saskatchewan played an important role in that push for an apology. The Archbishop of Regina, who oversees this church behind me, helped facilitate an initial meeting between First Nations, Métis, and Inuit leaders at the Vatican, which was where the Pope made an initial apology and committed to come to Canada and deliver that apology on Canadian soil. That finally happened in 2022, later that year, when during a 6-day visit to the country, the Pope first delivered that apology on Canadian soil in Alberta. That was a moment that sparked a mix of reactions and a range of emotions for residential school survivors. Now, I did have the chance to hear from a residential school survivor here in Saskatchewan earlier today, and he says for him it was an important step on his journey towards healing. Take a listen to what he had to say.
For those words coming from the Holy Father was very powerful. And the succession of those words has to be carried on.
Reaction continues to be very mixed to that apology. It's a difficult thing for many to grapple with. For some, it was an important step towards truth and reconciliation, but for others, they feel the Pope's apology, the words, didn't go far enough. They'd like to see further action from the Church, such as calling out the specific names of people involved in residential schools, and also releasing the documents that the Vatican holds tied to those schools.
Francis marked a shift in the relationship between the Catholic Church and Indigenous people. And so we talked about the apology before, but more widely, what are First Nations leaders saying about that part of his legacy?
Well, Ian, the Indigenous leaders I've been speaking with today are all saying that this relationship with Pope Francis really marked a major turning point. For one of the first times, they felt that the highest leader of the Catholic Church was receptive, was willing to listen, and that there was a constructive and positive dialogue and relationship when it came to listening and working with Indigenous nations in partnership on moving forward on these issues, on reconciliation. Earlier today, we heard from the National Chief of the Assembly of First Nations, and she's hopeful that the work that started under Pope Francis, much of it still in progress, will be able to continue. Here's what she had to say.
We don't want that work to stop, and at the same time, we've lost an ally today.
We're hearing many stories today, Ian, from some of the people that had the chance to meet with Pope Francis during his visit to Canada in 2022. And what stood out to so many was his willingness to take the time to listen, meet with residential school survivors, and hear their stories. In some cases, such as his visit to Iqaluit, he went to a school and met with 150 people. So many saying he really just took the time, no matter how much time that might have taken, to sit and listen. Be receptive and listen with compassion. So many will look to Pope Francis's work as an important role in reconciliation, but for others, his legacy will continue to be complicated. Ian?
Interesting, though, because Megan Williams, our reporter at the Vatican, also talked about just how striking it was that he listened to her and other people that traveled with him on that trip from Rome to Canada. Alexander Silberman in Regina, thank you. Now, before that visit in 2022, Indigenous leaders, as you've heard, met with him in Rome. And among those who went were the national Inuit leader, Natan Obed, and Cassidy Caron, who was the Métis National Council president at the time. They're going to speak with us live in just a moment. But first, I want to show you an excerpt of a conversation I had with them in Rome that week in 2022.
Well, how did you see the humanity of the Pope today?
Well, he greeted us as we came into the room, shook each one of our hands, listened intently as one of our elders lit the kudlik, our oil lamp, listened to us all through the presentations or the things that people wanted to say. And you could tell that he was actively listening. He had a translator with him who was consecutively translating as we were speaking. And in the end, he did speak a little bit, and actually you could tell that he didn't just stick with his notes. He also had something very specific that he said in relation to what we had presented to him. And I was very happy to see that he took such an interest in what we had to say.
And Cassidy, I see you nodding in agreement. So that was the sense you had in your meeting as well?
Yeah, it was. You could, like Natan said, is that you could tell he was listening, which is exactly what we set out to do during this meeting, is that we wanted to share our stories from our survivors from the Métis Nation, and we wanted him to listen. And you could see that on his face. And when our survivors talked about things that were more challenging, about the abuses that they faced, you could see that he had sorrow on his face and that he was feeling it as well. It was powerful to hear that from our survivors, and anybody who gets to hear those stories feels.
Okay, from March of 2022 to April of 2025, Natan Obed is president of the Inuit Tapiriit Kanatami. He is in Ottawa, and Cassidy Caron is a former president of the Métis National Council and is now the principal consultant at First Peoples Group, which is an Indigenous advocacy organization. She is in Huntsville, Ontario. Fantastic reconnecting with both of you. And Cassidy, let me start with you. What are your feelings today about the passing of Pope Francis?
Yeah, first of all, great to see you again, Ian. When I woke up to the news this morning of the passing of Pope Francis, it really just set forward a day of reflection, really, for me on the days that we traveled back to the Vatican, bringing with us survivors from the Métis Nation, and the work that has taken place since that spring of 2022. It was great to hear snippets of that interview that we did back then, and really thinking about what has taken place, but also the amount of work that still has yet to be done for the Métis Nation, for residential school survivors today.
And Natan, when you heard the news this morning of the passing of the Pope, what was your reaction?
Well, it was one of the first things that I heard this morning when I woke up. And when somebody passes away that has done great work in the world, I first and foremost want to give respect to him and to his family, and to recognize the legacy that he forged in the days that he had. And ultimately, the relationship that we have with the Catholic Church is complicated. But I don't have complicated feelings towards Pope Francis. He set out to work on reconciliation. He, I would imagine, pushed back against his own church policies and leadership within the Vatican. And for that, I'll always be thankful. And for the times that I had to interact with him and connect with him, and seeing him interacting with Inuit, First Nations, and Métis, you could tell that he had a humanity for all of us. That his humanity was his empathy, his graciousness, and his ability to listen, as has been said.
You know, as you say, a complicated relationship between many Indigenous people in Canada and the Catholic Church. And there's anger, there's frustration, quite understandably. I'll tell you one of the things I was struck by in Rome, talking to both of you, but also the day the Friday when he made his apology, which I think surprised some people, I stood outside that hotel in Rome where many of the delegates were staying, and people just came up to me and talked to me. And to a person, those delegates reflected the kinds of things both of you are saying about the respect they had for him, and in the case of some of them, surprise they had. And I guess, Cassidy, tell me a little bit, like to walk into St. Peter's Square, it's so grand, it might be so intimidating, you didn't know what was ahead for you there. What was it like when you had finally made contact with the Pope?
When we walked in there, it was absolutely overwhelming. The grandness of the buildings itself really was something that we had never experienced before. And certainly nothing that I had experienced, certainly nothing our survivors had experienced. When we walked into the room for the meeting with Pope Francis, again, we didn't know exactly what to expect. We didn't know what the interactions would be, but we had, I believe, about an hour where Pope Francis really sat and he listened to the stories that our residential school survivors wanted to share with him. They wanted to share what had happened to them, what had happened within their communities, and the impact that residential schools have continued to have on our communities and on our nation. And throughout the time that they were sharing their stories, Pope Francis really listened, and you could see that he was listening. And of course, in the days following, it was reflected in the apology that he delivered. You could see that he had heard what our survivors needed to hear from him, and that he reflected what they said, but also he reflected in a way that was meaningful to him to deliver an apology that meant a lot to a lot of our residential school survivors.
And let me finish with the same question for both of you, and this time, Natan, I'll start with you. What does the next Pope need to do to build on the work of Pope Francis?
Well, I always worry when leaders change that there's an amnesia for the progress that's been made under the last leadership. And I would imagine with the Catholic Church, it's just the same, is that you could have a wildly different Pope with different principles and policies. I do hope that the progress that we have made will be continued through just focusing on the respect for our human rights, the legacy of the apology, the work that has not been done on the implementation of the TRC calls to action, and just the support for the work that's undertaken by the Canadian Council on Catholic Bishops to really spearhead the reconciliation work that happens here in Canada. We still have a lot of work to do with the Catholic Church in the Vatican, but a lot of that work needs administrative help. A lot of the ability for a progressive relationship moving forward does depend upon the next Pope and their willingness to continue this work.
And Cassidy, what do you hope to see? What do you need to see from the next Pope?
When we left the meeting with Pope Francis, some of the words that he shared with us in our Métis delegation, he repeated back truth, justice, and healing. And he took that, he said, as his personal responsibility. So I do hope moving forward, the next Pope that comes in understands that personal responsibility to social justice and to the relationship that was formed between Pope Francis and the Indigenous people here in Canada. Relationship is where reconciliation begins, and I hope that can continue down the road.
Well, I was certainly impressed by the leadership and insight both of you showed in 2022. And as I say, it's nice to be able to connect with you again, though under sad circumstances. But thanks for speaking with us.
Great to see you, Ian.
Thank you very much.